Welcome to the AAUC monthly podcast series on building our collective American dream. I'm Dr. S.K. Low, President of Asian American Unity Coalition, or in short AAUC. In this December episode, we focus on what are the roles of the ethnic media, how can ethnic media and TV stations survive and thrive in this hostile environment of consolidation and decreasing advertisement. What can that community do to encourage our youth to embrace and grow the industry? We are very fortunate today to have a social entrepreneur and journalist, Mr. Rafi Kapoor, owner of 24 ethnic TV stations, to share his insight on the matter. Let's go to Jack Hanna, our AAUC board member and our host for this podcast today.
AAUC is very pleased to have join us for this episode the highly successful media entrepreneur Rafi Kapoor, CEO and founder of Daya TV, America's first South Asian broadcast television network. 12 years ago, Rafi and his family daringly launched a digital TV platform in the Bay Area that has grown to be one of the largest ethnically owned television networks in the country. We will be discussing how that happened and how Daya TV provides local ethnic communities a voice to tell their stories and obtain news and entertainment. Welcome, Rafi, to our podcast series, Building Our Collective American Dream.
Well, thank you for having me on this podcast. I think our story goes back to my career as a traditional journalist. Since I was 8 years old, I had a sense of what kind of career I wanted to pursue. So from doing formative internships in high school and college, having my parents facilitate opportunities for me, I was very fortunate to be the child of immigrants, but immigrants that understood that in America, if you work hard, you can achieve amazing things. It's very challenging to break into media, especially for minorities. We have such a dearth of diverse media owners. I was literally working as a reporter for an NBC affiliate when this opportunity came about to acquire a television station that was failing in my hometown in the Bay Area. And we decided to make an investment in January of 2009. And obviously there was so much uncertainty. Financing for any kind of company was very, very difficult. And so that gave us an opportunity to come in and invest frankly, at a level which almost was unheard of for a Bay Area television station. And I was able to get buy-in from my parents as well as my brother, which is really hard to do, to get your little brother to sign on to your business venture. But the four of us did it collectively, and there was no real sense of how this was all going to work, because in 2009, we had not officially transitioned to digital TV. There was this discussion for like 15 years for over-the-air broadcasting to transition to digital high-definition broadcast, and it was postponed until about June, July of 2009. And so what the broadcasters ended up doing is taking the way that they showcase content to digital. And it was a real revolution, because before you had just the one feed and now you could do multiple channels. We were not going to be an NBC, CBS, ABC station. We were complete independent, and the signal was quite poor, just covering parts of San Jose and parts of Santa Clara, California. But because of digital, we were able to expand our signal to reach the majority of the Bay Area. And so we go from reaching a couple 100,000 people to 5 million people plus. And then we were able to reach out to different communities of color, primarily Asian American communities, and build what became America's most diverse TV station. We launched with one Indian American South Asian channel, Daya TV, which is now the largest channel of its kind. Then we have added Vietnamese, Filipino, Korean, African American, virtually every niche that I could find. My goal was we can take this to other markets, and we're effectively building America's most diverse television station group. We are now the largest Asian American broadcast group in the country, and certainly one of the largest minority-owned media companies all told. And so we have 24 television stations now in our portfolio, ranging from a couple here in the Bay Area to two that we just acquired in New York City and Chicago and throughout Florida and a number of markets around the country. So I'm really pleased with our progress. And it all starts with serving local communities with niche, relevant content that they can't find anywhere else.
That's fascinating, Rafi. And if you could please explain to me how you transition the TV stations that you purchase and then reformat the programming in order to shape it for local ethnic communities.
Well, it's certainly not easy to find the right mix. I still continue to have challenges because differences in sensibility throughout the country are quite different. I'm from the Bay Area originally, so I have a really good sense of what goes on here locally. But the sentiments in Chicago or Fargo, North Dakota, where we have a television station, or Orlando, Florida, are completely different. And so I think what we found success in is finding local groups that have a strong sense of what's needed. I'm very pleased that one of the stations we just acquired in Miami, Florida, had a local Haitian group. And the Haitian community is quite a dynamic diaspora, and they're spread throughout Florida and New York City and Boston. And obviously, in the last couple of years, I've been learning about this, but they do tremendous coverage of what's going on in South Florida and what's going on back in Haiti, where their audience is. And this is also true in North Dakota, where we have a Native American channel, or in Chicago, where we have African American focused programming. So I think our success has been trying to cater to local groups that have not had a mainstream outlet and empower them with news and information, bringing a sense of live urgency of television, which I think is so important. I mean, that's what makes local television so powerful, is that you can get that immediacy to things going on in your community. And the reality is, we're not in an old society where we have 3 or 4 TV stations. There are a couple hundred channels in many of the major cities throughout the United States, free over the air, not to mention the millions and billions of video options you have through the internet. So this evolution is ongoing, but I certainly believe local television is going to continue to play a role in how we consume content.
I want to follow up on how your company has grown and your vision to target it to specific communities, resulting in a fragmentation of audiences that enables you to connect with them more intimately and creates a viable business venture on the one hand. And then on the other, coverage of news reporting for the community, finding what are the commonalities of other communities that are there locally with the ones that you target.
You know, it's been fascinating to see how these different communities leverage the technology, because ultimately it comes down to execution. It comes down to a vision that these different entrepreneurs that we work with can do. And I've been very impressed at seeing what folks are doing to cover their stories, because the reality is the mainstream outlets are not necessarily going to go into the Haitian community or the Vietnamese community or the Indian community and tell these narratives the way they necessarily should be told. And so I have an example of a wonderful man in San Jose that runs a Buddhist temple, and he has kind of a Vietnamese Buddhist flavored television channel, but he does so much community outreach. They do senior lunches in San Jose, and they've gotten to know the board of supervisors in Santa Clara County. They go to San Jose City Hall, and they're sitting there with the mayor and the other city leaders, and they're very involved in the community. And so this venue has become an extension of the Vietnamese community. So they have a community center that must be at least like 20,000 square feet. I mean, it's massive. And cameras there in their temple, in their community center. They go and cover events around Silicon Valley. And now, because of the quality of content, they stream it, and they're getting a global audience, which is phenomenal, from basically the vision of a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. I mean, he's not a businessman per se, but he's amazing. And this team of people that have put on this content where they do local talk shows. And I have personally seen when people that are running for office are going into the Vietnamese Community Center to talk heart to heart with the Vietnamese community. Was this even possible a decade ago? No, we didn't see any of this activity before digital over-the-air TV sprang about in 2009. So it's been more than a decade, but we're seeing these applications across the board, and it's just going to continue. And obviously, there's been so much consolidation. One of the challenges we have in media is that there's a lack of understanding, and maybe it's willful ignorance, where the FCC and Congress have allowed for enormous consolidation of television and radio stations in particular, and also newspapers. And so that means that you have hedge funds that buy things up, and they have spreadsheets and bottom lines that they need to demonstrate to their shareholders. Is that great for local journalism? Is that great for local communities? Not necessarily. And certainly a guy like me, who we're a privately held company, and I basically run the joint with our team, I can make a decision, say, let's run this Vietnamese channel. And no, it doesn't have to be making us millions of dollars a year, but he's doing an amazing community service. And it's something that we find very valuable. And over the long haul, we know that this kind of content will resonate for decades to come. And we want to be the home for that, the exclusive home for unique niche content that you can't find anywhere else. So obviously, there's not that many companies like us remaining. There's very little local local ownership left in media, especially in major markets. You can't just allow these huge behemoths of companies to swallow everything up, which they're trying to do because we are in a capitalistic society. So these are the balances and the trade-offs that we all have.
Recently read last week an article that was in the Washington Post that was discussing not broadcast journalism, but print. And it stated that over 6,000 jobs were lost and 300 newspapers closed in the past 3 years, and 2,000 has closed in the last 20 years as far as print journalism is concerned. What similarities and differences do you find between broadcast journalism and print?
Right. Well, I mean, the newspaper industry has been changed forever by the advent of the internet. And you could see the impact that Craigslist, being one aspect 15, 20 years ago, has had on classified advertising, which was a huge source of revenue for local newspapers. Obviously, things have changed. We need to recognize that the models of 20, 30 years ago have gone away. And that's led to a handful of successful newspapers out there, but they are mainstream. They were very large to begin with. And in some cases, they're publicly traded. And in other cases, they are held by very wealthy benefactors. And this is where, again, the ethnic media is going to have a challenge, because with the pandemic, are you really going to a grocery store necessarily to pick up your ethnic newspaper the way people may have done 3 years ago? And I think that's all changed. So all of these businesses have to iterate and adapt. The reality is we're living in a digital world, and people have cell phones, they have tablets, they have laptops. They're going to get news information in different ways. And the reality is that the consolidation is going to continue to happen because folks make very sophisticated arguments. They lobby Congress on a daily basis to try to aggregate as many institutions as possible to eke out a profit. And again, I'm a journalist by trade, so certainly it's frustrating to see any number of my colleagues get laid off, be disrespected, frankly. Certainly the diversity in newsrooms is still quite poor. And part of that is if you're in a situation where you're the child of immigrants like I am, if you're not from a super well-to-do circumstance, how can you take an internship at a newspaper or any kind of a journalism institution if you're not getting compensated, if it's no or low wage? And so it's going to be one of those things where you've got to have media organizations that are run by people that understand that framework and want to set up systems to help the next generation get into the business, because otherwise the media narratives that you see will come literally from elites, from a certain group of people that have the capital to get their messaging out there. And that's a huge challenge. But the reality is the press has always been full of elites. That is the nature of the business. Look at who's been running newspapers, television stations historically. It's not a bunch of local folks. These are very well moneyed, very well financed corporations generally.
The Washington Post article that I mentioned earlier also described a group called States Newsroom, which is a network of nonprofits that funds print journalists covering 25 state legislatures and their regulatory agencies. Would that model be a possible alternative to your approach in providing local communities with news coverage they should and need have?
Well, certainly the nonprofit journalism model is one that has value. And I do think it's very important to have investigative journalists that are given the time and resources to really do hard-hitting reporting. I mean, there is a distinct difference, but the newspapers are critically important and print is critically important to really dig through the muck and figure out what's really going on in society. And I have very close friends that are working as investigative journalists all over the country, in television, in newspaper, in radio. That deep dive journalism is extremely important, because the reality is a lot of folks in broadcast journalism have to do stuff that's a little bit more shallow, cannot be as deep. Now, there's immediacy to broadcast journalism, which is, I think, very attractive to someone like me, because I like to know what's going on right now. And I think what's relevant to you and hopefully provide context. But can you tell the full story? Generally, on a television station, it's very hard to do unless that news organization is willing to set aside the time to do 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and really do in-depth documentaries, which obviously is very costly to put together things of that nature. But all these journalistic forms complement each other. And so I do think while there's certainly a role for nonprofit journalism to play in protecting our democracy, frankly, I think broadcast journalism is incredibly important, because there is a sense we live in the time where the reality is most of us have very short attention spans. If they can listen to this podcast, that's actually a credit to them, because most folks are consuming things in 60 to 90 seconds. So again, we need all these aspects. Now, I think there are some institutions that really believe in long form. The nice part for those of us in television, we can now have a digital component. And so stuff that's left on the cutting room floor can actually end up on digital platforms, and you can tell a more complete story. So that's changed things where a lot of people now are doing content that's meant to be distributed digitally, and that's impacting folks. So again, I think all these things are complementary, and I'd like to think that our model is a successful one, but the reality is that I've self-propagated this in many respects. We've used our own capital, and how many folks that are in business want to do that? I happen to be a journalist, and so my sensibility is fundamentally different than virtually any other media group owner that I know of. I still do journalism, still hosting shows and conducting interviews, but I've also realized that we've had to scale our business in a certain way because we can't finance it without getting some economic support. But this is the trade-off, getting shareholders and then having a bottom line and then not being able to air certain kinds of content for fear that it will offend some sponsors' sensibility. That's a very real issue in corporate journalism.
And let me just follow up on that particular point. What concerns and how is it that you approach or avoid political ideology as far as your station's coverage of local current events? Is it of a concern? Do you just permit the local administrators of your stations to conceive of how they're approaching the coverage of events from a political or an ideological perspective, or completely ignore that factor?
That's a very good question. And I think a primary motivator of why we've continued to grow, because the reality is that we all have our own biases innately, right? I think one of the concerns I have is, frankly, there's a lot of folks that are entering journalism today that actually will go out of their way to say that they're an activist as well. And I don't think journalism is activism. You can certainly have a strong point of view. That's often content that's consumed at a higher level than just straight journalism, but it does lead towards propaganda where you have one-sided viewpoints. You're not giving the full story. And so I think what's critically important, at least for our news organization, and one of the channels that we started that we continue to run is called Dia TV. It's the largest Asian American channel by distribution. It focuses on the Indian American and South Asian community. And there's all these challenges we've seen, especially facing Asian Americans in recent years, because our stories have not been well told. Historically, we were not in newsrooms. We were not part of the coverage. Now, obviously, there's a much larger contingent of Asian Americans throughout the country. And so we're starting to permeate into newsrooms, but there are narratives that every community has. And so it's super important that a mainstream newsroom has diversity. And diversity doesn't mean just hiring a Chinese female or an Indian male or a Hispanic person or a Black person to do content. I mean, there are differences amongst faiths, amongst socioeconomic class. And I think some of that needs to be in the mix. And it's a very hard balance because ultimately you have well-educated people that come from certain backgrounds that get involved in journalism and storytelling. So for us, ideologically, I've gone out of my way to make sure that we are reflective of the community and tell stories of the community. And there's certain stories that we put out there that I may not necessarily like or agree with, but it's news. There are stories that people are putting out there in the world that we have to cover. I'll give you an example from 2021, which was very surprising. There was an effort called Dismantling Global Hindutva, which was a bunch of academics that put on a virtual conference, and their focus was to criticize effectively the religion of Hinduism, which is the predominant religion in India. And it was very offensive to Indians in India, as well as Hindus throughout the world. And because we broadcast it, a lot of that vitriol came towards us. And they were like, what are you guys doing? Why are you guys broadcasting this? This is awful. But we can't hide from sensitive topics. The political stuff going on in this country and in India are incredibly sensitive. We all have seen what's happened with the coronavirus and the impact it's had on China. Obviously, the US-Chinese relationship has changed dramatically in recent years. And you can't shy away from that. It's all very sensitive. I'm covering the border conflict between India and China. It's not a particularly great topic for me to cover because obviously I've grown up as an Asian American and I have very close Chinese friends, but we see what's going on. And so this world has gotten very small, and you're going to hear about flare-ups in every pocket of the globe, and you can't shy away from that. And it's going to offend some people because there are some people who want to paint a rosy picture of their community and their faith and et cetera. But the reality is that we do need to tell the truth. At least that's what we're trying to do. I will say this. There are news organizations out there that are well capitalized that are absolutely putting out spin because they have a viewpoint on the world that they want to espouse. But that's not how I was trained. That's not the way our news organization is going to do things. We want to demonstrate what's going on in our society to the best of our ability and have people work with us that can tell these stories with granularity and context. But it's very hard to do, and the balance is difficult, and we're fighting to do that every single day.
My last question, as far as ethnic communities are concerned in participating in local broadcast journalism, what are the challenges and how can your vision with regard to the expanding group of local TV stations that you're acquiring have an impact on changing the presentation of entertainment and news through local broadcasting to ethnic communities going forward?
Well, I've always been an advocate for having apprenticeships. They had this back centuries ago, but we have very, very bright young people that have amazing tools at their disposal today. And so these kids have talent. If they want to harness that ability and hone it and get exposure, we need to get them involved in a newsroom, involved in business, involved in technology, whatever realm they want to pursue. Those kids who get that exposure at a young age are far more likely to succeed and make a huge impact than kids who start at 18 or 20 or 25 or 30. So we need to get apprenticeships started with local businesses, with national outlets, and get young people in the mix. I can't even begin to express how important that is. So I think that's how we change the tide, how we improve society, get kids the exposure, and get them to meet people that have different perspectives, because then they can actually take that back, digest it, and hopefully come up with something even better. And we got to get more diversity in ownership. It's a real issue. Some of the other Asian American owners that I know have actually sold their properties in TV and radio. So we have very few remaining. And there's a couple of African American entrepreneurs, a couple of Hispanic entrepreneurs, but the numbers are pretty pathetic, and it's gotten worse since I've gotten in the business, not better. And this is where community organizations like yours can really speak to these issues, because it's so important. Because if your messaging is lost, I mean, the reality is Facebook is not a platform that you control. Mark Zuckerberg can turn it off anytime he wants, or YouTube. Google can turn that off anytime, or Twitter. So you got to have your own platforms. These third parties can shut off your ability to communicate. So this is why it's so imperative for me to continue to give outlets to different entrepreneurs. And we actually have Vietnamese women. We have this obviously Buddhist monk that does programming, and the Haitian community and the Black community. We have so many different entrepreneurs that we're just trying to give them runway to build their platforms. So hopefully this is just the start.
Rafi Kapoor, we thank you so much for joining AAUC's podcast series, and we thank you for your participation and look forward to your continued success.
Thank you, Jack, for your in-depth interview with our outstanding guest, Mr. Rafi Kapoor. The social entrepreneurship of Mr. Kapoor is truly admirable, and I sincerely hope for his success in establishing even a greater network of local TV stations. My main takeaway from your dialogues are the internet is a game changer for the broadcasting and news media. Many stations and newspapers are going out of business or being consolidated, but at the same time, the internet also provides opportunities for low-budget TV stations and others to survive, since the high-resolution broadcasting and imagery can be delivered digitally across many stations and all over the world. Ethnic-owned media can play a very important role in taking control over telling our own stories and delivering truthful news pertaining to our community as well as the world, and also serving the community to generate news. There's great need for more minority-owned news outlets to increase the diversity in reporting and to preserve the freedom of the press. Our AAPI community can get behind this media ownership by exposing and offering more internship opportunity in news reporting and generating contents for our youth. So let's work on it. Thank you for listening to our AAUC podcast series on building our collective American dream. Please subscribe and comment on our podcast. Do tune in to our next podcast on the last Sunday of January at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The topic will be on empowering Asian American across diversity and the role of the Asian American Foundation. Our guest will be Mr. Norman Chen, the CEO of the Asian American Foundation. The AAUC podcast is supported by active individual and organization members. For more information about AAUC, please go to our website, asamunitycoalition.org.